One quick note to start. Subscribing helps us reach more people with stories like this one, so thank you for being here. A word borrowed from people who lived 1,000 kilometers away is doing most of the heavy lifting in your family tree. It starts with a Greek historian. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus wrote about a population he called the Keltoi, living near the headwaters of the Danube. Central Europe, nowhere close to an island in the North Atlantic. That word sat mostly forgotten for over 2,000 years. Then, in 1707, a Welsh linguist named Edward Llwyd picked it up, dusted it off, and used it to classify the languages of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany into one family. Not a genetic family, a linguistic one. That single act of classification is the reason you now hear Celtic DNA, as if it were a settled scientific category. Here's the contradiction underneath it. The genetic population geneticists now label the Atlantic Celtic genome doesn't trace back to Herodotus's Danube-dwelling Keltoi at all. It traces to steppe herders, thousands of kilometers east of the Danube, who never once used that name for themselves, and who arrived in the British Isles by a route that has nothing to do with the people the ancient world actually called Celts. So if the word Celtic was never used by a single person in Ireland or Scotland until the 1700s, whose DNA are we actually calling Celtic today? The story most people accept goes like this. Celtic describes the ancestral ethnic and linguistic world of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany, held together by a family of related languages, split into two branches. Goidelic, meaning Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, and Brythonic, meaning Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. The textbook version of how that world came to exist is the Hallstatt-Latin model. Hallstatt, a salt mining culture in what is now Austria, emerges around 800 BC. Latin, a related but later culture centered in Switzerland, follows around 450 BC. Together they're treated as the engine room of Celtic expansion, a culture and a language spreading outward from Central Europe through migration and conquest, eventually reaching the British Isles by the middle of the first millennium BC. Roman writers reinforced this picture without meaning to. Julius Caesar, in De Bello Gallico, written in the 1st century BC, describes Gauls on the continent and Britons across the Channel as related peoples, cousins in the same expanding world. 19th century antiquarians took Llwyd's 1707 linguistic classification, combined it with Caesar's account of related tribes, and retrofitted the whole package onto Iron Age Britain and Ireland. The result is the version everyone already knows. The Celts as one branching people, moving west with their swords, their spiral art, and their language, arriving in Britain sometime in the centuries before Rome showed up. Modern DNA testing companies built entire product lines, Celtic ancestry expressed as a tidy percentage, on top of this exact assumed continuity. Here's the detail that doesn't fit. When population geneticists actually sequenced ancient skeletons from Britain and Ireland, the genetic substrate everyone calls Celtic was already sitting there a full 1,000 years before Hallstatt or Latin existed anywhere on a map. This is where it gets complicated. Ancient genome sequencing shows that the defining Atlantic Celtic DNA signature, carried on the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, working like a surname that never changes spelling, was already present in Ireland and Britain by roughly 2000 BC. That's the Bronze Age, not the Iron Age. Not anywhere near Hallstatt or Latin. The named source here is Lara Cassidy, at Trinity College Dublin, publishing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. Cassidy's team sequenced Bronze Age genomes recovered from Rathlin Island, off the coast of Antrim in Northern Ireland, dated to roughly 2000 BC. Those individuals already carried the Y chromosome lineage known as R1bL21, the lineage still dominant across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales today. They also carried the genetic variants behind blue eyes, and the HFE gene variant behind hereditary hemochromatosis, an iron overload condition still elevated in modern Irish populations at rates higher than almost anywhere else on Earth. Cassidy's paper effectively documented the first known Atlantic Celtic genome, a full 1,000 years before any Celtic-speaking Iron Age culture supposedly reaches Britain under the traditional model. The second named source backs this up at a larger scale. Ingo Olalde and colleagues, publishing in Nature in 2018 as part of what's known as the Beaker People Project, analyzed genome-wide data from more than 400 ancient individuals. Their finding: within a few hundred years, somewhere around 90% of Britain's existing gene pool was replaced by incoming migrants, associated with the Bell Beaker archaeological culture. between roughly 2450 and 2000 BC. 90%. Researchers are careful to frame this as a population-level estimate built from genome-wide statistical modeling, not a head count. But even hedged, it describes one of the most dramatic demographic turnovers documented anywhere in European prehistory. And the number behind that number is just as stark. Before 2500 BC, there is no R1b-L21 anywhere in the British Isles. None. No steppe-derived ancestry of any kind. The people living in Britain and Ireland before that date were genetically closest to Neolithic farmers in Iberia and southern France, not to any population anyone would later call Celtic. Before 2500 BC, no R1b-L21, no steppe ancestry, no Atlantic Celtic genome at all. By 2000 BC, R1b-L21 dominant, steppe ancestry embedded, the genome fully in place, not by years, by centuries. Here's the recontextualization. If the Atlantic Celtic genetic population was already fully formed in Ireland and Britain by 2000 BC, then it existed centuries before the word Celt existed anywhere on Earth. And centuries before Hallstatt or Latin, the actual cultures ancient Greeks and Romans were describing when they used the word Keltoi, had even emerged in Central Europe. The textbook order of events: Celtic culture forms in Central Europe, then spreads west, then arrives in Britain and Ireland, has the timeline backwards. The genetic population showed up first. The name and the culture it was borrowed from came 1,000 years later, from somewhere else entirely. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging. If this population predates Celtic culture by a millennium, where did it actually come from? And does it have anything to do with language at all? The first theory says yes, in a fairly direct way, but it doesn't fully answer the question. The mainstream genetic explanation traces this Bronze Age population back further still, to the Yamnaya, steppe pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian region, modern-day Russia and Ukraine, who began expanding into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago. Somewhere around the Rhine and the Netherlands, these steppe-descended groups mixed with existing corded ware populations before a portion of them crossed into Britain as part of the Bell Beaker migration. Haplogroup research, including work by Lucat, published in 2015 in Advances in Anthropology, and cited again in a 2021 paper by Armit and Reich in the journal Antiquity, places the actual birthplace of the R1b-L21 lineage in the Lower Rhine region. Not Britain, not Ireland. Not Iberia, despite how often Celtic and Iberian get loosely conflated online. The numbers today reflect that arrival almost exactly. R1b-L21 frequencies exceed 80% in the western counties of Ireland, and remain high across Wales, Western Britain, and Brittany. But they drop noticeably in eastern England, particularly East Anglia, a sign that the Bronze Age replacement wasn't a uniform sweep across the islands, but something patchier, stronger in some regions than others. This theory is solid on the genetics. It is considerably weaker on the language. It explains how the genes got into Britain and Ireland by around 2400 BC. It says nothing about when Celtic language showed up, because the Bell Beaker migrants left no writing, no inscriptions, nothing that lets a linguist reconstruct what they actually spoke. And mainstream Iron Age linguists still argue, on entirely separate evidence, that Celtic speech didn't exist in Britain until well over 1,000 years after these genes had already arrived. Genes first. Language, maybe, 1,000 years later. Or maybe not connected at all. There is a second explanation for how this gap gets closed. One that tries to make the genetics and the language arrive together, on the same timeline, through the same population. It's more contested than Theory 1. It has split archaeologists and linguists for the better part of a decade, and it changes what Atlantic Celtic might actually mean. The second theory says the split between genes and language was never a split at all, that both arrived together, just not on the timeline anyone assumed. It's called Celtic from the West, and it comes from John Coke, at the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies, laid out most fully in a 2010 volume bearing that exact title. Coke's argument runs against the grain of a century of textbooks. Celtic languages, he says, didn't spread outward from Hallstatt or Latin in Central Europe at all. They developed earlier and further west along the Atlantic seaboard, Iberia, Brittany, Britain, Ireland, carried not by an Iron Age invasion, but by something far less dramatic: trade. The name's support here comes from Barry Cunliffe, the Oxford archaeologist whose decades of work mapped what's now called the Atlantic Bronze Age, a maritime exchange zone linking Iberia, Brittany, and Britain by sea routes from roughly 1300 to 800 BC. Metal moved constantly along these routes. copper, tin, finished bronze goods, sailing up and down the same coastline for 5 centuries. Cunliffe's case is that language can travel the same way trade goods do, passed between the same trading partners, generation after generation, until entire coastal populations are speaking mutually intelligible tongues without a single army ever crossing the channel. Proponents of this model point to a later migration event, Urnfield associated, moving into England around 1200 BC, as a possible vector for Brythonic, the P-Celtic branch, ancestor of Welsh and Cornish, layered on top of the Atlantic genetic substrate that had already been sitting in Britain and Ireland since 2000 BC. Here's the problem. If Koch is right, it means the genes and the language still didn't arrive together. The genes came first, by a full millennium. The Bronze Age population sequenced by Cassidy's team on Rathlin Island, the one already carrying R1b-L21 in 2000 BC, would have gone on speaking something else entirely for 30, 40 generations before any Celtic language reached them at all. Celtic from the West was supposed to close the gap between Theory 1's genetics and the missing language. Instead, look closely, and it just moves the gap. It doesn't erase it. The population everyone now calls genetically Celtic wasn't born speaking Celtic. Celticness, on this model, is something layered onto an already existing people late, not something built into them from the start. Here's where even the people building these theories start hedging their own work. The third theory is the one most researchers are reluctant to say out loud in full, because it doesn't just complicate Koch's model, it goes after it directly. Patrick Sims-Williams, the historical linguist at Aberystwyth University, has published pointed, detailed critiques, arguing that Celtic from the West simply isn't supported by the linguistic evidence itself. Sims-Williams holds the traditional line, Celtic languages most likely did originate later, in the Iron Age, spreading from Central Europe, exactly where Hallstatt and Latin put them. If he's right, the implication is bigger than a dating dispute. It means the Bronze Age Atlantic Celtic genetic population, the one with the blue eyes, the hemochromatosis, the R1b-L21, may not have been Celtic-speaking for most of its existence at all. 2 separate stories. A genetic population in one place, a linguistic family arriving from somewhere else, centuries later, merged by modern audiences into a single word. And there's a complication sitting right next door that neither side has an answer for. Basque populations in northern Spain carry notably high frequencies of the very same R1b lineages found in Ireland and Wales. Yet Basque speakers speak Euskara, a language with no relationship to Indo-European at all, let alone to Celtic. Same broad genetic signature, zero linguistic connection. Direct proof that a Y chromosome lineage, on its own, cannot mark out a Celtic people, because if it could, the Basque country would be Celtic too, and by every linguistic measure, it isn't. The historian Simon James went further still. In his 1999 book, The Atlantic Celts, Ancient People or Modern Invention, his argument, there was never a unified ancient Celtic ethnic identity in Britain and Ireland at all. It's a modern construct built retroactively by 18th century antiquarians reaching backward for a heritage to name. Not something the Bronze Age farmers on Rathlin Island or the Iron Age tribes Caesar described would have recognized about themselves in any form. So which is it? A people with one shared identity, genetic and linguistic both, or a genetic population and a language family that happen to share a coastline and nothing more? Picture Rathlin Island, off the coast of Antrim, around 2000 BC. A small cluster of farmsteads above a rocky shoreline. On a clear day, the coast of Scotland is visible across the water, close enough that a boat could reach it before nightfall. Bronze tools are starting to show up here, traded up the same Atlantic sea routes that will carry goods for another 1,000 years, changing hands between people who've never met, on a coastline that stretches from Iberia to Ireland. The people living on this island right now carry a Y chromosome lineage, a genetic marker passed from father to son largely unchanged, like a name handed down without ever being translated, that will still be the dominant paternal lineage in Ireland more than 4,000 years from this moment. They carry the gene variants behind blue eyes. They carry the variant behind hemochromatosis. The iron overload condition still elevated in Irish populations today, at some of the highest rates in the world. This is real, sequenced data, recovered from real skeletons, not a reconstruction or a guess. And not one person standing on that shoreline has a word for Celt. Not one of them has ever heard of the Danube, or of Herodotus, or of a people called the Keltoi living 1,000 kilometers to the east. That connection, the one that will eventually give their descendants a name, is over 1,500 years in the future, and it will be invented by people who will never set foot on this island, who will never meet a single person living on it. Here's what all three theories, laid side by side, actually add up to. Celtic was never one thing. It's a linguistic label attached to a real Iron Age culture, Hallstatt and Latin, the one the Greeks and Romans genuinely meant when they wrote Keltoi, mistakenly fused just 300 years ago onto a Bronze Age genetic population from the Atlantic seaboard that predates it by over 1,000 years and had no name for itself at all. The population most people mean when they say Celtic today, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Breton, is genetically continuous with steppe-descended Bell Beaker migrants going back to roughly 2400 BC. That population never called itself Celtic. The Greeks and Romans never called it Celtic either. They reserved that word for Gauls and other continental Europeans, an entirely different genetic pool. The label only reached Ireland and Britain in 1707 from a Welsh linguist trying to sort languages into families, with no genetic data of any kind in front of him. And the actual historical Keltoi, the Central European people the ancient world was writing about, remain a different, far less publicized genetic population. No rigorous ancient DNA study has ever demonstrated that they are the direct genetic source of the Celtic populations of the British Isles. Not one. A geneticist working on ancient Irish remains once put it to a colleague more simply than any paper could. The bones don't know the word we've given them. They were never told what to call themselves, and they can't correct us now. Not solved. Enlarged. The DNA didn't reveal a Celtic people. It revealed that Celtic identity was assembled backward, genes pulled from one place and one era, language pulled from another, a name borrowed from a third, stitched together centuries after the fact into something that feels ancient, unbroken, singular. It never was. The same pattern shows up everywhere the word ancient gets stapled to a modern identity. Viking, Aryan, Celtic. In every case, a gene pool moves on one timeline, a language family moves on another, and a name gets borrowed from whoever happened to be writing at the time. And only much later does someone press all three layers flat into a single word and hand it to millions of people as an inheritance. Millions build pride, belonging, sometimes entire political movements, on Celtic ancestry, as though it were one continuous thread reaching back into the mist. Pulled apart carefully, thread by thread, it isn't one thread at all, it's at least three. A gene pool, a language family, and a name, running alongside each other for thousands of years, close enough to look woven together, never actually tied. The Celtic were never who we thought, and DNA didn't just reveal the truth. It revealed that there was never one truth to find. Only three separate rivers, flowing the same direction, close enough to be mistaken, for 300 years, for a single stream.